The lecture had been going for 45 minutes, and Cadet Marcus Webb was fairly certain he was the only one in the room who was genuinely enjoying it. That was not a popular opinion. He had made the mistake of expressing it once, to his bunkmate Osrin, and Osrin had gone the pale gray color that until Hari biology indicated polite disbelief, and had said, "Marcus, you are a strange creature," and had gone back to his revision notes. Marcus had taken that as a compliment. Professor Dinkareth was brilliant. That was simply a fact. A Sarati xenobiologist with 4 advanced degrees, field certifications on 11 worlds, and a publishing record that had been cited so many times that citing it had become a standard academic reflex. The way you cited gravity or atmospheric composition as a thing that was simply true and needed to be acknowledged. His teaching style was thorough in the way that oceans were wet. He did not believe in summaries. He believed in complete information, complete context, and complete delivery. And if your species found 3 unbroken hours difficult, that was something to work on. Marcus found it fine. He had grown up on a border colony where the school had 3 teachers for 400 students, and you learned to absorb information from whatever source was available, at whatever pace it arrived, because the alternative was not learning it at all. Professor Dinkareth was exhaustive and exacting and never once talked down to his students. Marcus liked him enormously. He looked around the room while the professor moved to his next slide. Osrin was to his left, gone the particular shade of gray that meant politely bored, his elongated fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the desk that he probably was not aware of. Osrin was Tilhari, which meant he communicated half his emotional state through his skin whether he intended to or not. And right now his skin was saying, "I have absorbed the information, and I am waiting for new information, and the interval is uncomfortable." Bohr and Mech were across the aisle and 1 row back, the 2 Dressel cadets who had arrived at the academy together and had remained inseparable ever since, conducting what they clearly believed was an inaudible side conversation. Dressel were large by most species standards, broad-shouldered and thick-limbed, with a natural confidence that came from being one of the bigger things in most rooms. They were good cadets, not academic standouts, but solid, reliable, the kind of people you wanted beside you when plans stopped working. Right now, they were debating something in urgent whispers and seemed unaware that their whisper volume was calibrated for a species with significantly worse hearing than half the room possessed. At the back, Cadet Prith sat in the motionless way of Helvari in low-stimulation environments. Helvari had the ability to enter a light meditative state that preserved consciousness without requiring active engagement, a useful adaptation for a species that had evolved in environments where waiting was often the most important survival skill. Prith used this ability regularly in lectures and had never once failed an exam, which Marcus respected on a technical level. Beside Prith was Cadet Sen, a Varric. The Varric were a small species, fine-boned and quick-eyed, built for speed rather than mass. And Sen had the particular quality that many Varric possessed of appearing to be paying attention to 6 things simultaneously. She was taking notes, watching the professor, watching the door, watching the window, and seemingly conducting some internal calculation, all at the same time. Marcus had studied with Sen twice, and she was one of the sharpest people he had encountered at the academy. She was also deeply, privately nervous about almost everything, a trait she hid well, but that Marcus had noticed because he had grown up around people who hid it the same way. At the front near the window was Cadet Grath, a Horan. The Horan were perhaps the most physically imposing species at the academy on average, bipedal but built on a scale that made the door frames a consistent inconvenience, with a dense layered musculature and a natural body temperature that made them warm to be near. Grath was quieter than most Horan Marcus had met. He took careful notes in the small, precise handwriting of someone who had been told their whole life that they were built for one thing and had decided to be excellent at something else entirely. Professor Dinkareth clicked to his next slide. The image that appeared on the wall screen was large enough that Marcus could see it clearly from the middle of the room, and detailed enough that for a moment the room got slightly quieter in the unconscious way that rooms do when something pulls collective attention without asking. It was a full-body diagram of a cavith. The scale reference beside it was a fully grown Sarati, which was not a small species, and the cavith stood a full head and a half taller at the shoulder and was roughly 3 times the mass. The diagram showed the body in profile and head-on. Triple-layered dermal plating along the dorsal surface and flanks. a jaw assembly that the accompanying text described as capable of 12,000 newtons of exertion. 4 primary limbs and 2 secondary strike limbs that folded tight against the thorax in a resting position, the joints labeled with force rating notations that Marcus read carefully.
He wrote all of it down. The Cavith, Professor Dinkareth said, and his voice had the particular quality it got when he reached a subject he found genuinely fascinating rather than merely important, represents one of the most efficient predator designs in the known galaxy. It is not the largest. It is not the fastest. It is not possessed of the most sophisticated neural architecture. What it is optimized. Every system in its biology exists in service of one function, and that function it performs without peer. Note the secondary strike limbs here. In their folded position, they are effectively invisible to a frontal observer, which is part of the design. The Cavith does not advertise its primary weapon. When deployed, each limb can deliver a percussive force sufficient to breach reinforced hull plating. Field researchers have documented Cavith breaching the outer walls of survey stations rated to Grade 6 containment. Marcus underlined, strike limbs fold, not visible front-on. Primary weapon concealed. The Cavith is currently the subject of ongoing research here at the Academy. We are fortunate to have a live specimen in the xenobiology containment wing on sublevel 2, which several of you will have the opportunity to observe during next week's practical session. Marcus had been looking forward to next week. The alarm went off. He had heard the drill alarm enough times to know this was not it. The drill alarm was 2 short pulses and a long one, regular as a metronome, designed to be recognizable without being distressing. What filled the room now was a single continuous rising tone, no rhythm, no pause, just a sustained sound that climbed and held. 1 second of silence. Then Professor Dinkareth was already moving, crossing the room in 4 long, urgent strides, hitting the emergency seal panel beside the door with both upper hands at once. The containment barrier dropped from the housing above the doorframe. 3 inches of containment grade 8 steel, and it seated into the floor with a sound like a vault closing. The bolts fired. The lock indicators on the panel went from amber to green. The professor turned and faced the class. Remain calm. This room is rated to containment grade 8. We are safe here. Academy security will contain the situation. Please stay away from the door and remain together. Osrin's skin went from gray to white. Bohr and Mech stopped whispering and moved to the far wall without discussion. Prith came out of his meditative state instantly, full alertness, his eyes very wide. Sen had already moved to put a desk between herself and the door, small precise movements. The reflex of something that had spent its evolutionary history being smaller than most of its problems. Grath straightened from his desk and said nothing, but his body language changed completely, the shift from student to something older and more animal. Marcus stayed in his seat for exactly 3 more seconds. He was looking at the door, specifically at the base of the door, where the containment barrier had seeded into the floor housing. At the gap on the left side, maybe 3 millimeters wide, where the barrier had not seeded cleanly, where corridor light was bleeding through in a thin pale line. Professor, Marcus said, Cadet Webb, please move away from the... What grade is this door rated to? The professor stopped. Just for a moment. The kind of stop that answers the question before the words do. The structural walls, ceiling, and floor of this room are rated grade 8, Professor Dinkareth said carefully. The door was installed during the original construction of this wing, before the xenobiology department expanded. The doors in this corridor are rated to containment grade 6. There was a budget reallocation in the 3rd academic cycle that deferred the upgrade, and the requisition has been pending for. Something hit the wall outside. Not the door. The wall beside it. The impact was enormous, a concussive boom that was less a sound than a physical event, and every loose object in the room jumped, and the overhead lights swung on their mounts, and a hairline crack appeared diagonally across the ceiling panel above the 2nd row of desks. Mech made a sound Marcus had never heard from a Dressel before. Something that was not words. Prith pressed his back flat to the rear wall, and said something in Helvari that Marcus's 3 semesters of xenolinguistics told him was either a prayer or a phrase used when prayer had already been tried. The second impact found the door. The steel barrier bowed inward. The concave dent that appeared in the center of the slab was deep enough to be visible from the back of the room. The bolts at the base of the door shrieked in their housings. The gap at the bottom left corner, which had been 3 millimeters, opened to nearly 2 centimeters, and through it came a low sound from the corridor, rhythmic, resonant, something between a vibration and a breath. Sen had gone the color of old ash. She was pressed behind a desk with her hands flat on the surface, very still, and her eyes were fixed on the door with the particular focus of a prey species that has received information it was not designed to survive. Marcus was at the equipment rack. He did not remember deciding to go there. He was simply there, moving along the wall, keeping low, because the rational part of his brain had already finished the arithmetic while the rest of him was still registering the alarm. The equipment rack held practical session materials for the xenobiology lab. He was moving his hands through it methodically. Containment poles, no good without the training to deploy them. Charging cables. A specimen sample kit. 2 canisters of coolant spray, used in specimen transport to disorient thermal tracking organisms. He took both canisters. He clipped one to his belt. He took the long telescoping presentation rod from the wall mount and collapsed it to its shortest setting, roughly 60 centimeters, and felt the weight of it. He looked at the door. He looked at the gap at the base. The gap was 4 centimeters now and growing. The bolts were losing. He crossed to the professor, moving quickly and low. The cavith tracks primary by thermal, he said, keeping his voice level. What are its secondary senses? Cadet Webb, this is not. Professor. Secondary senses. Dinkareth looked at him for one moment with an expression Marcus could not fully categorize. Then the scientist in him answered, because some instincts override everything else. Olfactory is secondary. Acute, range of approximately 40 meters. Vibration detection through the feet. It has mechanoreceptors along the primary limb pads. Visual is tertiary, range 6 meters, movement dependent. It does not perceive static objects well at distance. The coolant canister. How long does it disorient thermal tracking? 30 to 40 seconds per direct application. But if you are thinking of using that against a, which direction is sub-level 2 from this room? A pause. West. Below us. Cadet Webb, what are you? The supply closet, Marcus said. The large one in the back left corner. What grade is that door? Professor Dinkareth stared at him. Grade 8, he said. It stores grade 7 specimens during practical sessions. Marcus looked at the supply closet. Then he looked at the classroom layout. Then he looked at the door again. Okay, he said. He said it quietly, to himself, the way you say something when you have finished making a decision you cannot unmake. Okay. He turned to Osrin. Osrin was the color of chalk and his hands were pressed flat on his thighs, and he was breathing in the careful, measured way of someone who is managing themselves very deliberately. Osrin, Marcus said, I need you to do something. Osrin looked at him. Something moved across his face, and under the fear, Marcus could see the part of Osrin that was a cadet and not just a frightened person. What? When I tell you, open the supply closet door and get behind it. Hold it open. When I tell you to close it, and throw the bolt. Can you do that? Marcus, can you do that? Osrin looked at the supply closet, looked at Marcus. His skin shifted through 3 colors in fast succession and settled on something that was not quite steady, but was closer to steady than it had been. Yes, he said. The door came apart on the 3rd hit. The bolts at the base tore free, 2 of them, punching out of the floor housing and ringing off the tile like thrown coins. Then the left side of the barrier buckled. The top mount failed a half-second later, and the whole 3-inch steel slab crashed forward and hit the classroom floor, and the sound of it was enormous and final, and the dust came down in sheets from the ceiling. For a moment, there was nothing in the doorway. Then the cavith came through. Marcus had studied the diagram. He had memorized the dimensions. He was standing in the room when the thing entered it, and he understood immediately and completely that he had not been prepared. It was not the size alone, though the size was extraordinary, filling the doorway from frame to frame and ducking its head to clear the top. It was the quality of presence it carried. The way the room reorganized itself around it the moment it entered. The way the air changed. There was something that happened in the back of every living brain that had ever evolved in a world with predators, some ancient inherited circuit that fired before thought and said this thing, this is the thing, be still, be nothing, disappear. Every person in the room felt it. The cavith stood in the collapsed doorframe, and its head moved in a slow lateral sweep, jaw slightly open. The mechanoreceptors in its feet reading the floor, tasting the room. The triple-layered plating along its dorsal surface was nearly black. The secondary strike limbs were folded at the thorax, invisible from the front exactly as the diagram had noted, and Marcus filed that observation away with the focused calm of someone who was afraid but had decided that being afraid was not the primary task. Right. The head swung toward the back of the room, toward the cluster of bodies, toward the heat. It took one step, two, slow and certain, the way a tide comes in. Marcus stepped into the aisle. "Hey," he said. His voice came out level. He had not planned the word. It was simply the first thing that arrived. The Cavetha's head swung toward him. All four eyes settled on Marcus Webb. He was standing in the open, in the middle of the room, with a coolant canister in his right hand and a collapsed metal rod in his left, and he held the Cavetha's gaze and did not look away and did not move backward. The Caveth stopped walking. It tilted its head. That slow lateral tilt, something being reconsidered, a category being questioned. Its four eyes moved over him with a methodical quality, assessing. Marcus was aware of every person in the room not breathing. He was aware of Osran, in his peripheral vision, having quietly moved toward the supply closet and positioned himself beside it with one hand on the handle, because Osran was a good cadet and had heard what Marcus said and was going to do his part. He was aware of the distance from where he was standing to the supply closet, roughly 10 meters, and the angle, and what he would need to do to cover it. He was aware that the Caveth weighed 800 kilograms and he weighed 80, and that the numbers were not in his favor and had not been in his favor since the alarm went off, and that this was not new information. The Caveth took a step toward him. Marcus held his ground. Another step. The thing was enormous in motion. The primary limbs moved with a heavy grace. The weight of it translated through the floor. Marcus could feel it through the soles of his boots, a low rhythmic pressure with each step. It was reading him the same way he was reading it, tasting the air for chemical signatures of fear, watching for the flinch, waiting for the run. He did not run. When it was 5 meters away, Marcus raised the coolant canister and discharged it directly into the Cavetha's face. The effect was everything he had hoped for and slightly more. The coolant hit the thermal receptor clusters around the jaw and the upper face, and the Cavetha's head snapped back with a force that put a crack in the wall panel behind it. And the sound it made was short and high, and absolutely nothing like anything Marcus had read about in field reports. It stumbled sideways, one primary limb losing purchase, and it went into the first row of desks, and the desks lost comprehensively. Marcus moved. He did not run away from it. He ran at it, which was not a thing it expected, which was the point. He went inside the sweep of its head while it was still disoriented, and he drove the collapsed metal rod with both hands into the joint housing of the left secondary strike limb. Not the plating, the joint. The gap between the thorax armor and the limb housing, 2 centimeters of unplated articulation point that existed because the limb needed to move and things that moved had to have somewhere to move from. He put everything he had into the rod at that joint. The Caveth made a sound that shook the overhead lights. It swung a primary limb at him, pure reflex, and Marcus dropped flat, and the limb went over him and took out the second and third row of desks in a single sweep. And then he was rolling and coming up, and the Caveth was turning, faster than something that size had any right to be, and it found him, and it was not disoriented anymore. It was angry. There was a difference, Marcus noted with the part of his brain that was still taking notes out of pure habit, between a predator that was hunting and a predator that had been hurt. The hunting posture was patient, economic, measured. The posture the Caveth was in now was not that. The head was lower. The primary limbs were shifting weight forward. The secondary strike limbs were beginning to unfold from the thorax, and watching them deploy was an experience Marcus did not want to have again. The sheer size of them, the raw mechanical finality. He had maybe 3 seconds before those limbs were fully extended. He discharged the second canister directly at the unfolding joint mechanism of the right secondary limb. The coolant hit the joint housing and the Caveth flinched hard, the limb folding back involuntarily, the cold disrupting the muscle response. And that bought him 2 steps, and Marcus took both of them and hit the Caveth in the same left joint again with the rod, harder this time, and the thing stumbled, one rear limb buckling slightly, and Marcus got his shoulder under the jaw from the side and pushed, not trying to move the thing, not even trying, just redirecting its balance, the physics of leverage on something that was already slightly off its footing. The Caveth went sideways. It went sideways in the direction of the supply closet. Not all the way. 3 meters. But 3 meters was enough. Osrin, Marcus shouted. Osrin already had the door open. The supply closet was large, built for grade 7 specimen storage, and its door was a full 2 meters wide. Cold air came out of it in a visible current, the refrigeration units inside maintaining the low temperature required for specimen preservation. The Caboth's head turned toward the cold. Marcus hit it in the left joint one more time. Shorter strike, less force. He was running on empty now, but enough. The pain drove the Caboth a step forward, away from the source of hurt, toward the cold, toward the open dark of the supply closet. It crossed the threshold. Now, Marcus said. Osrin slammed the door. The bolt went home with a sound that Marcus felt in his chest more than he heard it. Grade 8 door, grade 8 housing, grade 8 bolts. All of it designed for exactly this. And the sound of it locking was the most satisfying sound Marcus Webb had ever heard in his life. From inside the closet, the Caboth hit the door once. The door held. Marcus stood in the middle of the classroom and breathed.
His left arm was not working correctly. He became aware of this gradually. The way you become aware of things that your body has been politely deferring until the immediate crisis is resolved. The primary limb that had gone over his head had not completely gone over his head. It had clipped his left shoulder on the way past, and the shoulder was telling him, in the clear and patient language of significant structural damage, that it would like to be looked at when he had a moment. He set the metal rod down on what had been a desk and was now mostly debris. He looked at the room. The front 3 rows of desks were destroyed. The doorframe was destroyed. There was a crack in the back wall where the Caboth had stumbled into it, and the crack went from floor to ceiling and had definitely not been there before. Ceiling panels were down, dust on every surface, and in the middle of all of it, 5 alien cadets and 1 professor, all staring at him. Osrin had gone a color Marcus still did not have a name for. That luminous silver, the one that appeared sometimes when Osrin was processing something that his existing emotional vocabulary had not prepared him for. Bohr was against the wall with his mouth open. Mech beside him, same expression. The two of them mirror images of a species that was physically imposing and had spent the last 4 minutes pressed against a wall being less imposing than a first-year human cadet. Prith was perfectly still in a different way than before, not meditative stillness. The stillness of something that has been profoundly revised in its understanding of the world and is taking a moment to let the revision settle. Sen had come out from behind her desk and was looking at Marcus with her quick, clever eyes moving over him the way they moved over everything, cataloging, filing, drawing conclusions. Grath, who was the largest person in the room and had been the largest person in most rooms Marcus had ever been in, was looking at Marcus with an expression that Marcus could not interpret at all. After a moment, Grath said something in Horan. His translator rendered it imperfectly, the way translators always did with Horan, the language not mapping cleanly onto the common tongue. What it produced was something like, he went to meet it. Professor Dinkareth was standing at the back of the room, where he had been since the barrier fell. His 4 upper hands were lowered. His expression was the one that Marcus had seen on him only when he encountered a piece of field data that contradicted an established model, and he was in the process of deciding how to update the model. He looked at Marcus for a long time. Your shoulder, he said. Yeah, Marcus said. You require medical attention. Yeah. You drove it into the closet. The left joint. It's unplated at the articulation point. 2 centimeters of exposed mechanism. Every time I hit it, the pain response drove it a step away from the source. I just had to make sure the closet was the direction it was stepping. Marcus paused. And the cold. You said it tracks thermal. The closet is cold. So there was no heat signature in there, which registered as empty, which is where things go when they want to be away from pain. The professor was quiet. That is, he said, and stopped, and started again. That is an accurate and concise summary of the mechanics. I had good notes, Marcus said. Security arrived 11 minutes later. 12 officers with grade 7 containment equipment. The lead officer was a Vorkai, tall even by Vorkai standards, who came through the destroyed doorframe and stopped and looked at the room in the way that people who do containment work look at rooms when the containment has already been done without them. Her eyes moved over the wreckage, over the cadet population, alive, accounted for, over the supply closet door, bolted, holding, over Marcus Webb, sitting on a piece of what had been a desk, holding his left arm against his body with his right hand. You, she said. You did this. He did, said Osrin from across the room, in a voice that was careful and precise, the way Tilhari voices got when they were saying something they wanted to get exactly right. He stepped forward when it entered. He drove it back. He put it in the closet. The Vorkai officer looked at Marcus for a long time. Her 4 eyes moved over him with the same quality that Kretha's eyes had once had, in a different room, in a different confrontation. That quality of reassessment, of a file being opened and found to contain different information than the label suggested. She said a word in Vorkai. Marcus did not speak Vorkai, but Sen did. Sen had 6 languages, including 2 that were rarely taught, and she knew Vorkai well enough that she heard the word clearly and understood it completely, and turned a color that on a Varic indicated something between awe and the specific feeling of watching a belief you have held for a long time quietly become wrong. The word had no clean translation. The Vorkai had many words that did not translate cleanly because the Vorkai language had been built over thousands of years by a species that took the business of being dangerous seriously and had developed precise vocabulary for things that other species gestured at. This word was one of the older ones. It meant roughly, the thing that stands in the open. But it meant more than that. It implied that the standing was not bravado, and not stupidity, and not the absence of fear. It implied that the thing standing had looked at what was across from it, and understood it completely, and stood anyway. It was not a compliment exactly. It was more like a classification. A formal placement of something into the correct category, after it had spent time in the wrong one. Marcus Webb, first-year human cadet. In the correct category now. The medical team arrived 4 minutes after security. They looked at his shoulder, exchanged a glance with each other, and told him he had done impressive structural damage to himself, and that the repair would take 2 weeks, and the rehabilitation another 4. He thanked them. They told him not to thank them for that information. He said he was thanking them for coming quickly. They told him that was acceptable. Osrin sat beside him in the medical bay later, while they were waiting. His skin had settled into a slow, steady gold. Marcus had learned gold. Gold was the Tilhari color for something like gratitude, or relief, or the feeling after something very bad has resolved, and the body is still catching up to the fact. You told me to open the closet, Osrin said. You opened it. You told me when to close it. You closed it. Osrin was quiet for a moment. I was afraid. I know, Marcus said. So was I. Osrin looked at him. His skin did something complicated, cycling through several colors before settling somewhere that Marcus did not have a word for yet. You did not look afraid, Osrin said. Different thing, Marcus said. Osrin considered this for a while. Then he said, on my homeworld, there is a concept. It does not translate well. It is for the thing that a person does when they are afraid, and they do the thing anyway. And the doing of the thing is not despite the fear, but somehow because of it. Because the fear tells you what matters. Marcus looked at the ceiling. His shoulder was in a brace, and the pain medication was doing its job, and the ceiling was a very neutral thing to look at. Yeah, he said. We have that too. In the incident report filed that afternoon, the reviewing officer read the account 4 times before she signed it. Then she added a note in the comments field that was not standard procedure, but that she felt was necessary. It said, Cadet Webb, M, human, first year. Contained grade 7 specimen without equipment, reinforcement, or prior training in live containment scenarios. Recommend commendation. Recommend updated xenobiology corridor doors. Recommend someone review the standard classification document for human cadets, because whatever it currently says, it is missing something. She looked at that last line for a moment. Then she left it in.